Shalom, I'm Dr. Dina Dye with Foundations in Torah, and welcome back to this series of teachings called In the Beginning. And in order to understand the Bible from the end, we need to go back to the beginning and make sure we understand Genesis 1. In fact, Genesis chapter 1 is probably the most important foundational chapter in the Bible, in case you haven't figured that out. And we have traditionally looked at it in terms of science, but my approach with this is to try to get back to the ancient mind. How did the ancient Near East view the first chapter of Genesis? I do believe if we can set the tone there, if we can begin to understand the model to the ancient world of Genesis chapter 1, it's going to open up the entire Bible in a way you can't even imagine. So a lot of what we're dealing with in Genesis 1 is the concept of temple and creation, which are essentially synonymous terms. Last time we talked and we introduced the idea of Bereshit, containing in it many different concepts and words and expressions that have to do with house building. The key to Genesis chapter 1 is the idea of building a house or building a temple. Why? The temple was built for the place of God's presence, the place where our God would dwell. And so this is key in understanding the entire chapter. And it will help us as we go through from creation really to the book of Revelation. I'd like to go back from last time and reread a quote from Dr. Margaret Barker. And I think this kind of encapsulates one of the problems that we have today. And it reads this way: "The temple is like an ancient tapestry. In some parts, the picture has faded. In others, the threads are no longer clear. It is impossible to understand the temple using 20th century post-Enlightenment ways." And so we understand that we're a product of modern culture, Western culture, and the temple is kind of a foreign entity for us. But you know, as you're reading the Bible, the idea of the temple or the tabernacle, the place of God's presence, the tents of the patriarchs, the garden, all these things, the place where God dwells, is ground zero for the Bible. And Yeshua, Jesus, practically every chapter in the book of John, for example, we have him going up to the temple to celebrate a festival or have some sort of ceremony. So clearly it's important. It was important to the first century people. And the second temple period is really, we have a lot of information on that, specifically from the Mishnah. Now, we don't really have any information much on the first temple, the temple that Solomon actually built. And we don't have a lot of information on the garden. But the whole goal for the ancients was to return to the garden construct, the place that they saw as perfection. And we really can't approach this from our 20th century modern mind. We have to try to get into the minds of the ancients. So hopefully as we go through this, things will pop out for you, answers to questions that maybe you've had, and you'll see this in the way they saw it. And of course, then we would make application for today. Now, I was a big fan of the Titanic growing up. The story was always fascinating to me. And I read recently and saw a special that was on PBS about they finally figured out what exactly happened to the Titanic and why it went down. And I bring this up because there's something about this story that for me shows the problem of looking at the Bible from a modern perspective and not spending the time to look at it from the mind of the ancients. So just a quick story here. There's a gentleman named Tim Malton, and he decided to look at the whole sinking of the Titanic in a whole new light. So he pored over eyewitness testimonies to the tune of 10,000 different references to it. And he went back into all the records of the ships that had passed through where the Titanic had that night, both 36 hours before and 36 hours after. And what he discovered was that particular night was described as the most amazing, calm, crystal clear night that anyone could ever remember seeing. And then the ship went from a warm water current to a cold water current, and that cold came up quickly. So the women had been out dancing on the decks of the Titanic, and suddenly they had to go in and put their furs on, just like that. And then all of a sudden, an eerie haze appeared in the distance. And the eyewitness accounts said that the Titanic never seemed to reach that Erie haze. It always was sort of out in front. So what we had here is that these layers of cold became trapped under the warmer air that was above. They call it a thermal inversion, and this thermal inversion creates light refraction. And so what it's called to us, what we would understand it as a cold water mirage. So like the mirage you would see out in the desert, this was a cold water mirage. And it's interesting because the captain of the California at the time saw the ship, but he was sure it was a different ship because to him, because of the light bending and the refraction, the ship looked like it was much smaller. And he knew that a smaller ship in the area did not have a radio, and yet here was the ship radioing for help. So in his mind, he concluded that the ship that he was seeing was not the Titanic, because after all, the Titanic, the other ship wouldn't have had a radio. So what happened was this stratified air basically distorted the visual and disrupted signals between the ships. So again, as the Titanic sailed from the western Gulf Stream waters into the frigid Labrador current, then this whole sort of this mirage, this cold water mirage appeared, and it created an optical illusion. So it wasn't just the California where there was an optical illusion because of this light refracting. But what happened was we have this sort of false horizon that's created, and it camouflaged the iceberg. So there was an area you can see here between the false horizon and the actual horizon. That was what Tim Malton called the Erie haze. But it was disguised. Because it was a moonless night and the seas were so calm, it couldn't see a contrast. And so the iceberg was basically hidden in this eerie obscured mirage layer. And then by the time they did see it, it was too late. So it was a very unique time. And so in my mind, it is though the temple, the place of the presence of God, the creation, the cosmos, all these different elements are hidden in this eerie haze, in this layer that we can't really see it. We tend to look above it, and we put everything in modern science and how we approach that. And yet there's all this information kind of hidden below the surface. So it's my goal in these teachings is to try to help you see the ancient world and how it functions just sort of beneath the surface. Now, the earthly temple reveals another world beyond time and space, and we call it eternity. So what we have, and we'll be talking about the separation between this world and the world to come, but this separation acts as a barrier between the two worlds. And so, in a sense, the world, the earth, as we see it, we are governed by the laws of nature. And in particular, the first thing that was created was time. But then there exists something outside of time, which we call eternity, which we also would call the heavenly temple. And between the heavenly temple and the earthly temple, one governed by time, the other outside the dimensions of time, is as though there's a curtain in between, we would call the firmament. And so these two worlds, these two temples work in conjunction with one another. What's happening in one influences the other. What's happening in the other influences the other. And so they're working in conjunction, but there's a barrier in between the two. Now, I mentioned in our last session this concept of myth because myth is very much associated with the world of the ancient Near East. And unfortunately, when we use the term, we're basically saying something isn't true. But that's not how they looked at it. So this other world, which we sometimes call eternity, this world beyond time and space, represented, if you will, the Holy of Holies in the temple. So pretend you have a temple. The front part of the temple would be considered part of the world in which we live in. And then there was a curtain between the two. Actually, there were two curtains between the holy place and the Holy of Holies. Now, you know, the high priest was the only one that could go into the Holy of Holies, and he just did that one time a year. It was as though he was entering into heaven. Okay, he was passing the barrier, the firmament, the curtain, as in the curtains between the holy place and the Holy of Holies, and entering into the place of eternity. And of course, it was there that he made atonement on behalf of the nation, that he stepped inside the world outside of time and he made atonement. Now we see a similar pattern with Yeshua because he is a picture of the high priest. And of course, he steps through time into the world outside of time and applies his blood to the altar that would be in the heavenly temple. But so we have this other dimension, another manner being, and I mean, not talking about space aliens here or alternate universes, etc. But you understand that we live here on Earth. It's a physical world. We're governed by the laws of nature. We function under time and space and those dimensions. But that there exists at the same time a world outside of time. And that is the place where our God dwells, in the world outside of time. And in the world outside of time, there's no spatial limitation there. And that world is not governed by time. And again, we call the other world, we call it eternity, we might say forever, these things. And so this is an important concept, and certainly in Judaism, they understand the world that we live in, the world governed by time, was called the Olam Hazeh, or this world, this present age. And the world outside of time was called the Olam Haba, or the world to come. So the world to come for the ancient Jewish mind is the world of eternity outside of time and space. And this present age was the one that was governed by the dimensions of time and by the laws of nature. And the Bible is replete with examples describing these two worlds. This is one of the reasons we have a lot of difficulty with the book of Hebrews, because if you don't follow, are we talking about the present age in which we live in, or are we talking about the future age to come? So we see this all through the New Testament, through the Gospels and the Epistles, the same sort of concept. So it's important to understand that that's how the ancient mind viewed it. Now, as far as myth goes, and again, I don't like to use the word simply because it's difficult for us to not think of it in any other terms, but sort of the symbols were the myth-building blocks of the ancient world. That's how they wrote. They wrote in terms of symbols and metaphors. They described the world around in images, and that's not how we describe our world. To the ancients, the heavenly world corresponded to a real specific situation on earth. We especially see that in the book of Revelation, and as you read through, that is by and large a temple text dealing with a temple in heaven and a temple on earth. So what's going on earth, the rumblings and the catastrophes and the cosmic sort of events on earth, is reflected of what's going on in heaven, and both have an influence on one another. So these two worlds, if you will, are mirror images of one another. So consider in the two worlds, we have in the temple on earth, we have the whole dynamic of the priests, how the king operated within the temple, all the various ceremonies and rituals. Well, the same thing is happening in the temple in heaven. So, for example, in the book of Revelation, there's description about the incense service. Well, we have to look on earth in the context of our physical world to understand that service, and then we can see it being played out in the book of Revelation in what we call heaven, or the world outside of time. Again, they're just mirror images of one another. Heaven is basically what we would call the eternal world, and earth, basically this world in which we live in. So, understanding creation language, temple language, all points to the way of understanding these two worlds, and in that context, understanding what God's kingdom actually means. So the creation account in Genesis 1 lays the foundation for all of this. And again, it's key to understanding the entire Bible. And so I'm confident that once you understand the basics from Genesis chapter 1, pretty much everything else is going to fall into place. And we'll certainly go through various stories in more details, go through the patriarchs and the matriarchs, etc. But all of those are recreation stories. We could argue as well, for instance, that the Exodus itself was a recreation story, that creation was being restored as the children of Israel came out through the sea. And again, this is another area that I'll be talking about in more detail as we go through these various sessions. So the idea of what Yeshua said on earth as it is in heaven is he's making a statement between what's going on in the heavenly realms, the temple in heaven, and what's going on earth, and both are having an influence on one another. And of course, he's speaking of things that are the kingdom, things that function in the world outside of time, things that we would say function in heaven. And so he is making that correlation, of course, talking to his disciples in that way. Another thing we have to understand to the ancient world, that the temple was the center and setting of all of their complex mythology. And again, I know we have difficulty with the word mythology, but if you understand, their whole pantheon of gods and goddesses had their center in the temple, in the temples that they would build, the deity would build, say in ancient Mesopotamia, if you will. The temple was ground zero for their lives, where they worshiped, where they took care of their god, their deity. Everything filtered out through that place. So we're going to find that the temple has much to teach us about creation. In fact, the temple or tabernacle is designed in the pattern of creation. We see elements from the creation in the temple, the constellations, the sun, the moon, etc. We see that more so in the Second Temple period and some of the descriptions that Josephus gives us. But the temple is the center point of space and time. Can't emphasize that enough. And again, it takes us back to the place where God dwells. And he dwells there for a specific purpose. Now, our God is different than the gods of the ancient world in that he created us to have a relationship with him. In the ancient world, the gods, the deities created humans in order for humans to take care of the god, to clothe them, to feed them, to work in the garden for them, to provide whatever they needed. Our God created us in order to have a relationship with him. This is very unique in looking at in the ancient world. Certainly the ancients would have sat up and taken notice at Israel, who had a relationship with her God. And so another aspect of this is that the idea of the temple was what brought stability to their world. It took their world from chaos, disorder, or non-order and created a stable place. And with that came the attribute of fertility. And so, of course, we see in the ancient world all this weird stuff going on in these temples with fertility goddesses and all that sort of thing. And some of it not very healthy for sure. But the idea of the temple was the place where life would come forth, where blessing and fertility would come from the God to the people. So we see a bit of a similarity, don't we, with ancient Israel. Now again, temples were the center of the world of the ancients because temples brought order out of chaos. This is very important, especially when we look at Genesis chapter 1, because order is coming out of non-order, if you will, in the first and second verse of Genesis, but order is coming. And so as we go through each of the days, we are building a house to the point where we get to the seventh day, the house has been constructed. And now the house is ready, and that is when the God of the ancient world would move into that house. Of course, in terms of what we're speaking of, our God would be able to move into his house that was finished on the seventh day. And again, removing all chaos from the world in which they lived. The temple was the point of stability and order. Now that's supposed to be the same thing for the family, because the family is a picture of the house. And we could also say it's the same thing for the congregation. The congregation is a picture of the house. And so when the congregation, the family, husband and wife, when the household is in order, it brings stability and order to those around in its sphere of influence. When a family is out of order through various things, it could be a divorce, it could be some kind of addiction, it could be a death, it could be anything. Whenever there's an element of chaos that comes in, the family structure has the potential to completely collapse. Obviously, if our relationship with Messiah and God comes to bear, then that family can be restored. That's key. That would be recreation language. But in its basic meaning, when the family is in chaos and crisis, that affects everything. Now, the temple was seen as being at the center of the ordered world as God established and preserved order in the world from the temple. That is the place from which he preserves order. God has given us a privileged role in the functioning of his cosmic temple. Now, that's a quote from John Walton. And that is really key because we have a role to play. Genesis chapter 1 isn't so much a description of how things work or what order they were made in or what they're made out of, as it is a chapter devoted to purpose and function. And so we, as people of God, need to find our purpose and function within the context of the temple. We have a privileged role, as John Walton said, in the functioning of his cosmic temple. In order to understand the words of Paul, who spoke eloquently, as we are a temple for the Holy Spirit, none of that makes any sense unless we go back to the beginning and we understand the temple language, what it meant to the ancient people, and how that applies to us today. And so the goal through this series is to help us see the connection between that and to help us understand all of that picture in the scriptures. A biblical worldview is a vision of the unity of all things and how the visible material world relates to another dimension of existence that unites all things into one divinely ordained system known as the Eternal Covenant or the Creation Covenant. So I would suggest that in the beginning, remember, it's not a chronology, but a house building expression, that the agreement or the covenant that's made between two parties, in this case between heaven and earth, is spoken of as the Eternal Covenant or the Creation Covenant. Another term we could use for it is the Brit Esh, or the Covenant of Fire. And I don't want to go into it quite yet, but I just want to plant the seed, because the Holy of Holies was described as a place of fire. If you read through a lot of the Second Temple period writings, in particular the Book of Enoch, in fact, the Holy of Holies was called the House of the Tongues of Fire in that type of apocalyptic mythological language. Remember, it's symbolic language, and that's the way it's described. And so the covenant, anytime you have a covenant, it's cut into two parts. And that you have two parts and they come together to make the covenant agreement. And then the two become one. So as we go through the creation week, we're going to see that is the way creation came forth, is separating out elements and bringing them together to create life, or for two to become one. And so this divinely ordained system of unity was called the Eternal Covenant or the Creation Covenant. This is key especially when we go into the book of John and we're reading in John 15, 16, 17 and all those places, and we see Yeshua talking about I and the Father are one, etc. And it just keeps kind of repeating, and we're going, what is he talking about? But think about those of you who are familiar with Hebrew, the Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Well, what on earth does that actually mean? I mean, we understand God is one, he can't be divided. But what does that mean in terms of creation? And so I would suggest to you the idea of one is when the two worlds are restored. So the idea that we have this present physical age being separate from the world to come, as though an agreement has been made and cutting a covenant. And that when those two worlds join together, that covenant agreement is made and they become one. And I'm going to talk about this as we go here. But this is really, really critical to understand, I believe, in understanding the first chapter of Genesis. Because if we go there, we'll see everything has been divided. So for instance, heaven and earth are separated. We see that light and dark are separated. We see that the waters above and the waters below are separated. We see dry land from gathered seas. This is a repeated theme. And ultimately, we see Adam and Eve being separated. And that is in order to make a covenant between two parties so that the two can come together, become one, and produce life. And this is the nature of the eternal covenant. That is to produce light. So this is critical. Now, it tells us a number of scholars has suggested that the temple is basically a miniature cosmos. So you take the grandiose nature of the cosmos, and that's just hard for us to get our arms around. And so we, with the tabernacle and the temple, we create this miniature cosmos. So it has all the elements of the cosmos in it. And so all the furnishings and the ceremonies, they all possess this sort of cosmic element. And they all are symbolic or representative of something in the cosmos. Again, this is hard for us. This is not the way we're used to thinking. But as we go through the design and structure of the temple and the tabernacle, we are in fact going to see that it very much has a picture of the cosmos, because where does God dwell? In the midst of the entire ordered universe, the cosmos that he created for man in order to have a relationship with him. The temple is the epitome of the world, a concentrated form of its essence, a miniature cosmos. There we see it again. It is not a place in the world, but it is the world in essence. So the temple perfectly reflects the world in which we live, and it is a mirror image of the world outside of time. And again, I am just laying out some very basic, important foundational aspects so that we can understand the rest of the Bible, because everything takes us back to Genesis chapter 1 and this concept of the house. The temple and its furnishings did possess cosmic symbolism. Such features were designed to stress the divine power over the created order and to establish the temple as a source of blessing for the land and for the people of Israel. So we go back to this concept. What was the purpose of the temple? Purpose and function is our focus. That is how the ancients viewed things. Certainly, first and foremost, was to have a place for the presence of God where he would dwell. And when he took his place in the temple, that brought blessing, fertility, prosperity upon the people and the land of Israel. And of course, that was when we see Israel in the land, in her proper place, we see that blessing flows out. Just take a look at Israel today. And I had been there back in the early 70s and had gone back in 2000, and the transformation was amazing. So we'll leave it here for this time, and we'll pick it up next time as we talk about in the beginning. Shalom.